Hello and welcome to the Onchain portion of the newsletter for June 21st. What I wanted to go through today is a handful of DeFi protocols actually. So stepping outside my usual comfort zone of the fixed cap, hard supply monies, and starting to look a bit more into the Ethereum ecosystem. So this is certainly, you can't deny there's an enormous amount of evolution and technology that's going on, and there's a lot of innovation going on in the DeFi space. You all know that I've had some doubts along the way, but I'm certainly open-minded to start to just watch how this thing starts to evolve. We've seen a lot of movement in some of these DeFi tokens, and as I was trying to go through this whole process, I really couldn't fit more than a handful of these in a single newsletter. So what I'm looking to do is start to explore on a more regular basis, just have a look at some of the tokenomics of these projects, looking at how the ecosystem is evolving, and trying to get a bit of a broader view just to see where the opportunities really lie with this kind of thing. So there's three that I wanted to go through today. And we, a bit of a mix of some exchange tokens, some money markets, things like that, and we'll go over the compound token at the end, which has obviously got quite a bit of interest. But the first one we'll go over is Kyber Network. So Kyber Network is more or less a decentralized exchange protocol. The way that it works is it pulls liquidity from a number of places. So there's the Kyber network has their own liquidity reserve pools. They also key into things like Uniswap and Oasis and a number of other DeFi protocols. So the way that it really works, it uses multiple liquidity pools. It then matches the trade, so the incoming to the outgoing. And then a lot of Kyber has actually been tied on the other side into other things like dApps, wallets and exchanges and smart contract wallets and things like that. So it kind of pulls a lot of, it's almost like an aggregator of both its own and other liquidity pools. And then it also connects itself into a whole bunch of other dApps and other structures, which, to be fair, Uniswap, you can kind of see how a number of these pieces, and in the DeFi ecosystem, they refer to as money Lego. The idea is plugging in all these different components together to then create a more holistic system. So Kyber is one of those main players in that front. It has, what it's got going for it. It's got a fairly intuitive interface. It's got a lot of functionality to do things like limit orders, which there's a handful of these exchanges that are starting to get a little bit more interesting and building things, not just a market order, but putting in limit orders and things as well. So the idea is that you would lock your whatever token it is, be it ETH or KNC, whatever goes into it, you lock it into a smart contract, and then when that price and liquidity become available, it will then execute. So it's kind of a delayed, so you've already paid the gas for the transaction and it will wait for that to actually occur before it goes ahead. So it's fairly innovative on that front. And a bit of a view on what the KNC token is called. It stands for Kyber Network Crystal Token, bit of marketing jargon. And really what this is the primary investable asset, how I guess you would invest to capture some form of the revenue that's flowing through the model. Now, you'll see with a handful of these tokens, there's kind of two key elements, but one of them you kind of split up, that these tokens are doing. The first one is it's capturing some kind of revenue from the model. Now, some of these actually distribute that income as it could be ETH, or it could be you actually get paid in a staking reward or something like that. So that's kind of like an inflationary or a payment type system. You get some revenue from the transactions that are flowing through, whatever the protocol is. The option for KNC, what they've opted for is just a fee burn model. So it's a bit more like what BNB has done with Binance, where they'll burn a certain portion of their tokens based on the protocol or the exchange revenue. So what this does, it prevents wash trading because there's some cost. All trades and market makers and things like that have to burn KNC as a result. And the idea is that it reduces the supply. So that's kind of it's kind of a proxy to gaining some kind of fee revenue for the model. My personal view is I actually prefer systems where you would be paid in some kind of income generating system rather than a fee burn, because a fee burn has a lot more market based. Just because a token is being burnt doesn't necessarily mean that it has much value. You need to actually have some kind of reason to want to buy that particular exchange token rather than something else. So, and we'll touch on that in some of the risks and challenges later on. And the other thing that these tokens tend to do is have some kind of governance of the protocol and the treasury. So a very common theme in all of this is going to be governance, protocols, treasuries, DAOs, all this kind of stuff. So it's hot topic. I'm telling you that governance is going to be one of the key talking points going into this next cycle. And a very, very large number of players will do it wrong, and we're going to learn a lot of lessons from it. So certainly be keeping an eye on this, and always be skeptical of the notion of governance, because at the end of the day, it always comes down to who actually has the tokens. And in a lot of these models, you'll find that the token distribution is not overly great for facilitating an active and decentralized governance. So to date, KNC's basically burnt about 5 million tokens, and that's over a period of about 1.5 years. That's kind of capturing the bulk of that feed burn chart. And yeah, it's about 2.3%. So to be fair, there's a fairly substantial volume going through the network. So and even so, and I think it's on this next page, I think even so, if you see up in the top right-hand side here, this is just comparing the top 3 DEXs that have some kind of, there's some DeFi Pulse. I know there's other exchanges. These are the top 4 that they've got listed there. And you can actually see that even though Kyber's burnt 2.3% of its total supply over about a year and a half, it's still only it's the 4th performer. So, and you can see here actually my risk and challenges. The DEX space is a very crowded marketplace, and it at the moment has been outcompete by Uniswap, which is a token-less model. And I'm kind of the opinion that a token-less model will actually outperform. It's less friction than a token burn model, but we will see how these play out. So what I like about it, it's clearly got VC interest behind it. They've got their Coinbase listing, so that's obviously going to have some kind of impact and increase the liquidity. I put it into the basket of pumpermentals, right? That's a key fundamental metric across all markets at this point in time, including our favorite, the stock market. And the revenue burn it's a tangible and easy grasp model, right? It's very intuitive for someone to take any knowledge from his traditional finance and apply it to the token. So it's easy for people to grasp. The governance I kind of see as a bit of a pseudo governance. At the moment, the top 16 wallets, some of those being exchanges, hold about 70% of the Kyber network token. And the token model is relatively fluid. So my understanding is that it used to have a different model, and has since had the actual token value capture mechanism has changed a couple of times in its model, in its history. So it says it's directed by the governance, but again, if you take it back to that point before that, it's kind of a pseudo governance. So it is a little bit fluid. I think a lot of these tokens are going to be swapping and changing their models. There'll be new mechanisms of value capture that get pioneered, and we'll talk about comp later on. So there's new models that are being pioneered that will feed into this and actually create new models that tokens will switch to. What is the hype of the day? We will see a lot of this as we go forward. And there is a reliance on price oracles. And the reason I've bolded this guy is you will find that this thing is in every single one of these models. So a fundamental underpinning of DeFi is the notion of pulling prices from somewhere and using them to set money markets or set trades or whatever it happens to be, set liquidation levels, things like that. Now, for those of you who believe that oracles can be done on chain, then obviously that a lot of these things actually do link in with Chainlink. So if you believe that there's a model there, and clearly a large portion of the market does, then there's obviously a value capture there for the Link token. I'm in the camp that I don't think price oracles can be solved with this, but again, when you look around, it doesn't necessarily matter. If you, as long as you have that risk in the back of your mind, and you're aware of the implications of what that means, you know that it is a risk and a challenge for all of these protocols, then you can obviously act accordingly. But it's a common risk that you'll see up in all of these different tokens that we look at today. So the next one is I think it's Aave. I think it's pronounced Aave protocol, and they use the Lend token. So this used to be called ETHLend. It's now been rebranded to Aave protocol. Now, Aave protocol is interesting. So where Kyber Network was a DEX type model that is specifically focused on giving users and apps access to their offering, Aave is more of, I would call it a developer toolbox. So they've kind of pioneered a standard set of tokens, but they're not exactly tokens. You don't go to the Aave website like you would for Kyber and actually perform a swap or take out leverage or anything like that. It's a protocol that's built a toolbox of things that developers, and it does have tokens. You will see the tokens in your wallet, but you don't necessarily go to Aave to buy them. They get built into other people's dApps and other people's applications, and kind of they draw upon that code to then make whatever their application is more interesting, more exciting, more, whatever it does, whatever the actual action is. And these guys pioneered the notion of a flash loan. So a flash loan, it's somewhat of a complex transaction. Well, it is a complex transaction. And the idea is you don't need any collateral to execute it. Now, because code runs sequentially, right? If you run a particular line of code, it will run top to bottom, and it doesn't know that the commands that are coming later on will be executed until the code reaches that point. So in the little flowchart diagram we've got here, imagine that this is, it is scripted out in code. The idea is that you can borrow collateral. You can then go and do an exchange. You can arbitrage a price. You can throw it into a compound thing, take out a loan, move that loan over to somewhere else. All of these sequential actions can be built into a single long transaction. And as the code runs, eventually at the end of that transaction, you've borrowed ETH, you've gone and arbitraged a spread, you've taken a bit of a profit, you then rebuy the original collateral, and then you close the loan. And all of this happens in a single transaction. And it's actually quite innovative, because at the end of the day, if you do not repay, if the total transaction doesn't repay the entire loan in a single transaction, then it doesn't go through. If it does go through, then all of those operations have occurred. So it's kind of this almost, it's very binary. It either happens or it doesn't. And you don't need any collateral for this type of system. So the idea is in a single transaction, you can execute a whole string of code, spend a stack on gas, but ideally, if it executes, then you pull out a guaranteed profit at the end of it. So I'm not quite sure how there's any kind of retail level access to these kind of things. I think it still remains in that dev toolbox, and smart coders can kind of play with these things. But I can certainly see that there's use in things like arbitrage and all that kind of stuff. But it's certainly it's a powerful tool, and those powerful tools can obviously be used for good and evil. So there's two sides to that. So it's interesting technology, that's for sure. And in the background, what's basically going on? So not only have they built this flash loan technology, but they've also basically built interest-bearing tokens. So you can lock it into a liquidity pool. It creates these A tokens that are for a particular token, and the idea is it will generate interest similar to Compound. So that it's kind of a similar model to Compound, but more on the developer toolbox side of things. And the Lend token has a fairly similar model to Kyber, in which it's basically a fee burn. Every flash loan has a 0.09% fee associated with it. Same with interest-bearing tokens. There's a fee associated with these things. And they're trying to build in a governance layer. I mean, there's a fairly common story you'll start seeing here, but in 6 months, it's burnt 0.013% of the supply. If we think about what Kyber was doing in 3 times the time, in 1.5 years, in 18 months, it had burnt 2.3% of the supply. So you can see there's obviously a lot more volume or burn to volume ratio for Kyber network than there is at the moment for the Lend token. So what I plan to do longer term is kind of map out all of these tokens and look at the total value locked versus the fee burn versus the token valuation, right? And we can start to look for where we're getting overvaluation, undervaluation, PE ratios, all that kind of fun stuff. So we can look into that in more detail down the road. So an overall summary of Aave, what I like, it's got a reasonably unique vision. I like that they've gone the dev toolbox side of things, and I can see them being built into a lot of these applications. There is the focus on that dev side, which actually means that they spend less time building user interface, right? They don't have to build all the user toolboxes and exchange faces and all that kind of stuff. They can focus just on the tech and allow other people to deploy that into their own user interface. So it probably means they'll be able to dedicate more time to building the product rather than the front-facing customer service, right? I kind of like that model. And it's a relatively novel architecture. They've got some clever ideas in there. So it's unique in that regard. Now, the Lend tokenomics are actually fairly standard. There's nothing really that exciting about them. It's fee burn model and governance. It's going to become a very tired type model, I think. I'm not entirely convinced that any of these would actually pass the Howey test as a security. I am still suspect of that. I don't think we've quite learnt that from the ICO phase. I could be wrong. I could be proven wrong, but it's certainly a risk that we should all be aware of. I think I've only left that challenge in this particular box, but we should apply that same potential risk across all of these tokens and across the entirety of the DeFi space. I think that's something to be cognizant of. Again, governance is very pseudo for Aave. Between the core team and Binance, that's 65% of the supply straight off the bat. There's only three wallets, I think. Two of them are Binance. So very concentrated. And again, there's our friend reliance on price oracles. So that remains a risk. And I think these guys do use Chainlink as their primary oracle provider. Now, the last one is the one that's probably generated the most excitement over the last few days. And to be honest, probably for good reason. Compound has released their token, and we'll explore this in a bit of detail. And I'll actually show you InstaDApp, which is an interesting way if you wanted to experiment with actually mining comp, or they're calling it farming, I think, in meme world. We'll go through some of that just so you can see what's been going on. So a bit of an, I'm sure a lot of you have looked at or used Compound. The idea is it's a money market. So you deposit some token, let's just start with ETH. If you deposit ETH, you could then borrow DAI up to a certain value of that ETH. So it's similar to Maker, but in fact, it kind of is Maker. It's a similar model, but it started with multi-collateral. And I believe as of yesterday, they are now the largest money market, having now taken over Maker for total value locked. And a very large portion of this, and we'll see in the next chart, is because it has basically introduced this fairly novel liquidity farming mechanism, is what it's being called, touted as. So the way it does it basically pools liquidity for lenders who earn interest and borrowers who pay the interest, and it spreads that across all of the people. If there's a lot of demand for borrowing Tether, then there'll be a larger interest rate. If there's no demand, then there'll be none, right? So the more liquidity, the more lenders there are. If there's lots of lenders and not many borrowers, there will be a very, very low interest rate. If there's a higher degree of borrowers to lenders, then there will be a much higher interest rate. So it is purely supply and demand. And you can see this fairly hockey stick looking chart. The total value locked in Compound has basically just mooned. Now, the reason for this is the liquidity farming. You can deposit any number of collateral, and I believe that if you deposit BAT, you can borrow DAI. If you deposit DAI, you can borrow Tether. It's all about pooled liquidity and total value. So it is an interesting and innovative model on that front. Now, the comp token is a pure governance token similar to Maker. And you can provide vote power, or you can delegate to somebody else. They've got a little novel governance portal going on, and you make decisions over collateral and risk and stuff like that. So it's fairly similar to the Maker model on that regard. Now, the way that it's launched is really the latest craze. I mean, it's only been going on for about a day or two, but it's been referred to as liquidity mining, or liquidity farming, or yield farming, I think people are calling it. Now, the way that this works is comp has been set to be distributed over the next 4 years at a rate of 2,880 comp per day. And the idea is that if you've got a liquidity pool, whoever's paying interest, so 50% of that 2,880 comp, 50% of it will go to people who are lending and accruing interest, and the other 50% will go to people who are borrowing, right, and gaining that interest and paying that interest. Sorry. Now, if you have liquidity on both sides, if you deposit ETH, you are now earning some portion of that comp, and then if you borrow DAI, you're now earning a little bit more. So that's kind of the notion, right? You can deposit and borrow and actually accrue comp on both sides of that. Now, it's all based on supply and demand. So if everybody wants to borrow DAI, then the DAI liquidity pool will gain a larger share of that 2,880. So if nobody's borrowing BAT and there's no demand for the BAT liquidity pool, either on borrowing or on supplying, then it will have a very, very low portion of that 2,880 comp going to the BAT pool. So that's where we start to move into, and the right-hand panel is a snip of InstaDApp, which I'll talk through in a moment. The distribution mechanism is quite clever because what it's done, it's incentivized people to provide liquidity, which is the sole function of Compound. The idea is to provide borrow and lending liquidity. Now, using Instadap, which is it is a smart contract wallet, and it's got a very clean interface. Actually, they've done a very good job at making it user-friendly. So, in fact, it's almost one of the most user-friendly apps I've seen in the space. So, props to Instadap for building that particular thing. Now, we were saying before that you accrue interest both as a lender and as a borrower. Now, what happens if you borrow let's just say $2,000 worth of DAI? You then go and swap 1,000 for USDC. You've now got both sides, right? Now, you've borrowed 2,000. Sorry, hang on. Let me take this back. You deposit a certain amount of DAI, let's say $2,000. So you're now accruing interest on that. You now borrow a certain amount of USDC. So now you're generating, you're still holding $2,000 worth of stablecoin because DAI is stablecoin, USDC is stablecoin. You've deposited one and are accumulating interest, and you've borrowed the other. And because the rate at which you can borrow and lend stablecoins, because they're 1-to-1, the collateral ratio is fairly close to 1. So the idea is that you could borrow that USDC, buy some more DAI, lock it back into the DAI, borrow more USDC, and you do that little cycle a number of times. And the idea is that with Instadap, it does this all in one go. You end up with a leveraged position, but because you've borrowed stable coins, it's kind of 1-to-1. So you're accruing interest on one side, paying interest on the other, but because they're 1-to-1, you're only paying a much smaller spread. If you're paying 2% interest but earning 1.5, then you're only paying 0.5%. So therefore you can borrow more and more of these coins, right, these stable coins, to lock yourself into a position. So you'll accrue a small amount of interest, but at the same time, you're basically farming the comp token. That's where this liquidity mining comes in. So you're providing liquidity to both sides and accruing comp tokens, which is a fairly interesting model. So what I like about this is it's very innovative, and it's an interesting way of actually getting cross-asset liquidity pools incentivized by people providing that liquidity. You saw that hockey stick chart. It's clearly working, right? Comp basically shot up to be the #1 DeFi protocol almost overnight. So I do believe that this will be a big feature, and I suspect it's going to become more commonplace because it is so novel and innovative. And it is kind of deserving of the current hype. I think the token is exceptionally overvalued right now. I really don't think that it should be up at, I think it's at $330 at the time of writing. I really do think that's a little bit over the top. I think it's mostly driven by the fact that there's very few tokens on the market, so you don't need many people trying to buy it to actually push the price in a strong direction. Now, the risks and challenges of all this thing, there is a risk with these liquidity pools of insolvency. Now, this could happen if suddenly Tether was to implode. All the Tether liquidity would dry up, and suddenly all the loans that have been given out could very well be underwater. I don't know what their repayment mechanism is. We obviously saw that Maker had that problem, and they had to reissue Maker coins to basically pay that debt. So we will need to see how this plays out. But it's certainly, complexity is the enemy of security, and I do see a lot of complexity in these models. The admin keys seem to have been distributed to the DAO now. So, I need to confirm the actual details of all this because it's all a little bit cloudy with these DeFi tokens. But governance is no easy feat, and they're going to have to deal with these problems one by one. There will be errors. They'll get things right. They'll get things wrong. I'm not entirely sure how comp accrues value. There's no token burn or similar model. I need to go back and review their tokenomics paper a little bit more to understand whether longer term there's an intention for it to be a fee burn or something like that, like Maker. And yet again, we've got our friend reliance on price oracles. So you can kind of see there's a bit of a theme there. So that's hopefully a bit of an overview. Conscious of time, I'll just jump into Instadap now just to show you exactly what this thing is, because it's a very, very useful little module. Now, the idea is that this is a smart contract wallet. So the idea is that you've got your ETH in your MetaMask. If you were to deposit it into this smart contract wallet, it's kind of like entering an ecosystem. You've now deposited the ETH, and any transactions you do within Instadap will use the ETH for fees that's inside Instadapp. So it's kind of like entering an ecosystem, and then everything that occurs within that ecosystem, you still sign with the same key, you still use MetaMask, everything still looks the same. The difference is that you're now using the ETH that's inside Instadapp to do all of the different actions. And you can see from this main page, so you would deposit whatever token you want here, and they've obviously got a number of these things you can deposit and work with. You can do any MakerDAO borrow. You can borrow and mint DAI via MakerDAO via the same interface. Likewise with Compound. If we click into Compound, you should now be able to see you can, from within your Instadapp wallet, you can now deposit from Instadapp to Compound. You can also borrow DAI. You can use all of these different tokens that you've deposited into your smart contract wallet, which is kind of one step beyond MetaMask. And once you've deposited a number of tokens in here and you've built up a liquidity pool, you can use this thing here called maximize comp mining. And the idea is, I don't have any coins in here. I'll see if this works. No. So what you'll need to do is open a DeFi smart account. So you basically, your first transaction creates the Instadapp wallet, then you deposit, then you can function with all these, Compound and Maker. And, you can see up here, they've got trade. So you can actually use things like Uniswap, and you can trade between tokens as well. You can do refinancing. So if Maker has a better rate than Compound, you can just migrate in a single click transaction all of your funds from one liquidity pool to another. And this maximize comp mining thing will do that, as we were saying before. It'll borrow DAI, create USDC, borrow DAI, create USDC, and build this liquidity pool. So anyway, that's a bit of an overview. It's kind of one step beyond just a hardware wallet. The idea is it's a hardware wallet that interfaces with a smart contract, which then has all your money in it. So it's kind of a bit of a rabbit warren in that front. Anyway, that's what I wanted to go through today. It's certainly an interesting space. There's a lot of innovation going on in the DeFi world. There's no question it's pretty hard to keep track of all of these things. And what I'm certainly would put to the RSC members is let me know if there's any particular protocols that you want me to look at, that you want me to explore and look at further. It's such an evolving space so quickly. It does take time to actually get around to all these things, and there's so many things to keep track of. So if there's anything in particular that you're interested in me covering, just let me know in the chat room, and I'll do my best to get around to it. Until next time, thank you.